Earlier this year, in a lab at Columbia University, researchers led by Diet Eggley introduced a protein into a human embryo. The protein found a single letter in the embryo's DNA, one chemical base among 3 billion, and changed it. Base editing, a molecular tool that rewrites heritable human DNA, the kind that can pass to every cell of every person that embryo could have become. They published their findings on a preprint server before any peer review. The American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, which had issued a moratorium on clinical heritable genome editing over a year earlier, said the research flew in the face of what the scientific community had asked for. The research was funded privately. The lab operated legally. Every institutional review box was checked. I've spent a long time with this story. I'm still not sure exactly where the line is or who had the standing to draw it. The embryos were edited, their DNA was changed, and the people they might have become, no one asked. In 2021, the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy and the International Society for Cell and Gene Therapy jointly proposed a voluntary 10-year moratorium, a formal request to pause clinical heritable human genome editing until the field could establish clearer safety and ethical standards. It carried no legal weight. A year before that preprint landed, leading scientists and societies reaffirmed the call. It was a moral statement. In late 2023, a startup called Nucleus Genomics announced a $14 million funding round, bringing its total to around $32 million. The investors included Founders Fund, associated with Peter Thiel, along with 776 Neo and Balaji Srinivasan. The CEO was Kian Sadeghi, who had founded the company at age 22. Being young and raising money from prominent investors is not a character indictment. That's the system working as designed. What I'm pointing to is something structural. A major part of the scientific community said, "We are not ready." The investors said, "Here is $32 million. Both of those conversations were happening across the same years. The moratorium urged restraint, while capital moved in the opposite direction. Conviction and funding are two different languages. In this story, they were spoken by people not required to reach consensus. There's a word for the gap between those two conversations. I'll come back to it. The moratorium asked people to wait. Nobody told them they had to. In 2018, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui announced he had created children with edited DNA using CRISPR to engineer HIV-resistant genes. The experiment was condemned internationally. He is serving 3 years in prison for illegal medical practice. That is the version of this story everyone condemned. The more precise comparison, though, is a 2020 study from Eggley and Treff's own team, which used CRISPR to edit human embryos. Every embryo showed chromosomal damage, 100%. That is the scientific benchmark the 2026 results are measured against. Nathan Treff, co-senior author of the Columbia preprint, the biggest success here was that base editing didn't introduce aneuploidy in these embryos. 0% large chromosomal deletions. That is real. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. What also appeared? Mosaicism. Different cells ending up with different versions of the edited DNA. Off-target edits, varying substantially depending on which guide RNA was used. Thanos Papathanasiou, a fertility specialist, who commented on the work, "We all agree we are not at the stage of discussing clinical application. The CRISPR approach was cruder. The institutional wrapper in 2026 was cleaner. Those are the two differences I can identify with confidence." Eggley's lab targeted PCSK9, linked to familial hypercholesterolemia, a hereditary condition of dangerously high LDL cholesterol, and HBG1 and 2, relevant to sickle cell disease and related blood disorders. Documented human diseases with genetic causes. That was the stated scientific rationale. Of the embryos treated, 73% carried the intended base change in at least some cells, nearly 3 out of 4. But mosaicism was high across the board. Many of those embryos had both edited and unedited cells mixed together. That represents a measurably different safety profile from the prior CRISPR embryo studies, which is genuinely meaningful scientific progress. And I also want to tell you about Kian Sadeghi. Sadeghi is the CEO of Nucleus Genomics, the company that funded Eggley's experiment. In one interview, he described embryo gene editing as potentially part of what he called a genetic optimization stack for IVF. He has discussed the idea that parents might eventually optimize for traits beyond disease prevention, cognitive capacity, physical characteristics. Eggley said, "What matters is what's going to be done in the project. We want to fix mutations that cause disease." I believe him. And the system that produced this research doesn't require him and Sadeghi to want the same thing. Eggley needed the science to work. Sadeghi needed the science to work. What happens after it works? Who uses it? For what? In which regulatory environment? That's where their interests may diverge. Nothing in how this research was funded, conducted, or published required them to agree on that before the preprint went live. Fyodor Urnov put it plainly: the Better Babies via embryo editing crowd will use this work to supercharge their unethical work. He didn't say Eggley's work was unethical. He said it would be used by people whose work is. Nobody in this story constructed the system they're operating inside of. They just happen to fit into it with a precision that, once you see it, is difficult to unsee. In June, Kathy Nyakan's team at Cambridge published in Nature, peer-reviewed, formerly overseen by the UK's Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. Different country, different oversight framework. They used base editing to study embryo development. Same conclusion about clinical readiness, not yet. The knowledge produced in both labs is now public. One on a preprint server, one in Nature, and available to anyone who wants to build on it. Let me give the other side the strongest version of its argument. R. Altacharo, bioethicist and professor of law who advises WHO, UNESCO, and the US government. I am of the opinion that it is morally defensible to use heritable genome editing if it is in fact proven to be sufficiently safe and effective. She is saying, if the evidence gets there, the moral case can be made. That is a reasonable position. The Ethics Committee at Columbia reviewed this protocol and approved it. The embryo donors gave informed consent. The experiment was conducted openly, and the findings published on an open access preprint. The embryos were never going to be implanted. These are not weak arguments. Charo also said, the more we chip away at concerns around safety, the more we're forced to confront fundamental questions. There is a genuine split of opinion. Those frameworks, ethics committees, informed consent, were designed to protect research subjects, adults in clinical trials, people who can sign a consent form. They presuppose that the people making the decisions have the standing to make those decisions on behalf of the people who will live with the outcomes. The embryo donors consented to research. Nobody asked their potential children. You might say, those embryos weren't implanted. No child exists. There's nobody to ask. That's not the same as nobody. There is a law called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, passed in 1995, before Dolly the sheep was cloned, before the human genome was fully sequenced, before base editing existed. It prohibits federal funding for the creation or editing of human embryos. It says nothing about private funding. That gap has never been closed. Not because nobody noticed it. Everything in the Columbia experiment was legal. Every box was checked. He Jiankui went to prison. That is true. What is also true is that in the years since, the field did not slow down. It distributed. Korea's Institute for Basic Science co-authored the Columbia preprint. Cambridge published that same month. Last year, more than $500 million moved into fertility technology startups globally. The aggregate of individual investment decisions, each rational. The scientists who have concerns are mostly not writing op-eds. This is not cowardice. Speaking loudly costs careers and funding. Staying measured costs nothing visible. The system produces this outcome reliably. I want to give you a framework. 2 prisoners, held separately. Each offered a deal. Testify against the other. Go free. Stay silent together. Get a light sentence. Both testify. Both get a heavier sentence than if they'd cooperated. The rational move, if you cannot coordinate, is to testify. Every time. No country has a reason to unilaterally stop this research while others continue. The moratorium asks the scientists who endorsed it to pause. It does not bind Chinese state-funded labs, Korean public institutions, or the next startup in a jurisdiction that hasn't thought carefully about these questions. Every actor in this situation is responding sensibly to the environment in front of them. Nobody is making a reckless decision. That is the problem. The gap is not bad intentions. It is a structure in which the incentives of the people making decisions were never required to align with the interests of the people who will live with the outcomes, and no crisis has yet been large enough to force that confrontation. Columbia's paper came out in June. 3 years from now, you might be sitting in a fertility clinic. The doctor walks you through the standard options: genetic screening, embryo selection. Then she pauses. She mentions there's a newer category, not approved here, not available anywhere, not yet. But the research exists, and she's informing you because that's her job. You go home. You find the preprint. You find the Cambridge study. You find the scientists who think it's too early, and the ones who think the direction is right, and the ethicists asking questions that nobody with actual authority has yet answered. And you realize this decision is not like other medical decisions. Other decisions involve your own body, your own risk. This one involves a person who does not exist yet, a person who cannot consent, whose genome would be permanently different, the kind of different that passes to every cell, every generation, because of a choice made before they were born. You are not weighing your options. You are deciding for someone who isn't in the room. The embryos in Diet Eggley's Columbia lab were edited. The preprint came out in June 2026. The embryos were edited. Nobody asked them.